And yet, during this same time, in all that had to do with the inner life of the nation, they were just as surely being conquered by the Romans. They were learning to live in cities, to read and write, to make better weapons and clothes, to use money, to like fine things, and to live more orderly and peaceful lives. For, at the time we begin to study about them, you can hardly imagine two peoples more different than were those on opposite sides of the Rhine-Danube frontier. The Romans were living somewhat as we might be living now, if we had never heard of steam engines or gunpowder. They had great and beautiful cities, filled with everything to please the taste, with statues and pictures, magnificent public and private buildings, with great stone circuses where thousands of people spent a day or two every week watching athletic sports. Broad and smooth roads connected these cities and made it easy for the one or two men who governed all this mighty empire to send a message with wonderful swiftness from Rome or Constantinople to the borders of Scotland or of Persia. The Emperor Tiberius traveled to visit his brother Drusus from Pavia to beyond the German frontier, nearly 200 miles, in 24 hours. The news of the murder of the Emperor Maximian was brought from Aquileia to Rome in 4 days, an average journey by land of about 130 miles a day. The Germans, on the other hand, were living rather better than the best of the North American Indians lived when white men first came to our country. They had no cities, but lived in rude villages with no strong walls to keep out enemies. They got their living mainly by hunting and fishing. What little agriculture they had was chiefly managed by women. They raised what was needed to carry them through one winter, but had not learned the value of money, which helps men to exchange what they do not need for themselves for other things which they want. Their dress was of skins or rude cloths. They had no one ruler like the Roman emperor, but were broken up into many tribes, each of which had its own leaders. Not hereditary kings like those of Europe today, but chosen by the people. War and hunting were their only honorable occupations. Of these two races, the wild, barbarian Germans are far more interesting to us than the elegant, civilized Romans, partly because they were to be the conquerors in the great struggle, but also because those among them who were to break the line of the Rhine and Danube were own cousins of those others who were to cross the sea and settle in England, and whom we are proud to call our ancestors. Cousins also of those others who yet much later sailed from the same shores of the North Sea, went to school for a few generations to their more civilized relatives in Normandy. And then crossed over to England to help in the making of that great people from which we have sprung. We are fortunate in having preserved to us an account of the Germans, written by a Roman near the end of the 1st century. This little book of the Roman Tacitus was evidently written to show his own countrymen how much better in many ways the Germans were than themselves, and to warn them of the dangers which they might expect, if they did not learn some lessons from the despised barbarian. By noticing what things about the Germans seem most remarkable to Tacitus and to other much later writers, we can get a clearer idea of the great differences between the two races. All speak of the immense size of the Germans, and skeletons found in some ancient graves prove that they were indeed a race of giants. Then their fierce blue eyes and blonde or red hair served to make them still more terrible to the smaller, darker, and gentler Roman. The life of the forest had been for centuries doing its work of building up these warriors to be capable of bearing the cold, patient, of fatigue, and, above all, brave beyond any known people of the earth. War was their delight. Again and again the Roman writers speak of the fury with which they rushed into the battle, of their indifference to wounds, and even of the gladness with which they met the death which was to unite them with Odin in the joys of the hereafter. Then their family was pure, almost alone among barbarians, says Tacitus. They are content with one wife. The husband whose wife was unfaithful cut off her hair, expelled her from his house, and flogged her naked through the whole village. No one in Germany laughs at vice, nor is it the fashion to corrupt and be corrupted. Good habits are the more effectual than good laws elsewhere. Good habits are here more effectual than good laws elsewhere. On the other hand, they had the vices of their condition. They were so immoderately fond of drinking that it was counted no disgrace to spend a whole day and night over their cups. Gambling, too, had such charms for them that they would even stake their liberty on the game. But the man who got a slave by such means was glad to sell him out of sight as fast as possible for very shame. Still more singular must their military arrangements have seemed to the Romans, who were used to the strict control of the state over the service of every man. The Germans, having, as we have seen, no great single state like that of the Romans, were accustomed to serve some leader who had the name of being a brave and successful captain. They would join such a man in groups of tens or hundreds, or it might be of thousands, and bind themselves to him by an oath. He in turn was bound to lead them faithfully, and to give them a fair share of the plunder. If for a long time there was no war going on at home, the chief and his followers would go where there was a war and take service on one side or the other. Of course, a war against the Romans was always the most popular. This loose military organization will explain why it is that we so often see groups of Germans of very different names fighting side by side at one moment, and at the next perhaps engaged on opposite sides in a new conflict. It will explain also why the Germans were able to enter so freely into the service of the Roman government. It will further help us to understand the great importance of individual leaders in all the enterprises of the Germans. The leader held his place only so long as he kept up his reputation for bravery and success, and thus the fighting men of a tribe were always sure of a leader worthy of their own courage and devotion. You can see what an immense advantage this gave them over the Roman army, which had little to say in the choice of its own leaders, and was obliged to wait for orders from a government hundreds of miles away, which might at that moment have interests at heart that did not in the least concern the men of the legions. But now if we turn the page and read in the Roman writers of the 3rd and 4th centuries the account of the life going on all over the great Roman Empire, we shall be shocked at the terrible difference. One has some idea of the wickedness of life in the great cities of the world today, but we should have to multiply that many times to get any conception of the dreadful state of Roman morals at the time when the Germans began to threaten the frontier. Perhaps our picture of the time will be clear enough if we add to all the temptations of modern life, to immoderate wealth, desire for amusement, lack of religious principle, weakening of home attachments, the crowning evil of human slavery. The Roman slave was not the dull and degraded savage whom we associate with the word slave, but he might be a man in all ways the superior of his master. And the absolute control over the life and happiness of such a human being must have been far more brutalizing than if the owner could really have felt that the slave was only a step above the brute. With these slavish ministers to every want, the Romans sank into the wretched, though splendid existence, which horrifies us in every writer, from Juvenal to Sidonius. The Germans in the 4th century were, as we have said, nearly as barbarous as the American Indian. But there was one great difference between these two, that the German had the capacity to learn, but the Indian had not. The Indian, coming into contact with the civilized man, learned of him only his vices. The German, meeting the Roman, learned of him how to govern, how to read and write, to cultivate the ground, to build cities, and to live in them, to put aside his old religion and to take that of the conquered Roman. One wonders why the great Roman emperor did not call out a mighty army as he had done in the old days and hold the line of the 2 rivers so that not a German should set foot across it. The fact is that this very elegant and luxurious life of the Romans had made them unable to defend themselves. Once Roman armies had conquered the civilized world, but now native-born Romans enjoy life so much in their theaters, their circuses, their baths, and their beautiful villas in the country or at the seashore that they did not care to go into the army anymore. They much prefer to pay money to hire soldiers to do the fighting for them. And when a nation comes to that, it may begin to say farewell to its greatness. Now the best soldiers to be hired were the Germans. They did not have to ask leave of any rulers. Often they came, rulers and all, across the border and let themselves for money to the Roman generals. It mattered little if they were then employed to fight against their own brothers. They earned their pay, saw the world, and went home to fill the ears and the eyes of their kinsmen with the wonderful story and the precious spoils of Rome. Or they stayed in the army and rose to high position, so that from the 4th century on we find the very highest posts in the army and in civil life filled by men whose fathers had lived the life of the German barbarian. There was one other barrier which might have done more than the river line to hold the 2 races apart: the difference of religion. But long before the frontier was broken, this barrier gave way. By the end of the 4th century, those of the Germans who lived nearest the borders had received the gentle message of the gospel and had become, after a fashion, Christians. Just how this work was accomplished we do not know. Only one name has come down to us of the darkness. Only one name has come down to us out of the darkness, that of Ulfilas, a West Goth who lived early in this century and who invented an alphabet, made a written language for his people, and thus gave them the Bible in their own tongue. Exactly as our own John Eliot gave the Bible to the Indians of North America. A fragmentary copy of this Bible, written in silver letters on scarlet parchment, is kept in the library of the University of Uppsala in Sweden. This community of religion helped to draw the two races nearer to each other. The same gradual approach was helped along by commercial dealings. Though not as yet a trading people themselves, the German had in time come to want many of the good things of the Romans, such as wine, ornaments, arms, spices, and finer clothing. The Roman traders who came to them over the border had brought far more than the packs on their backs. They too had carried the story of Rome, of fertile lands, of boundless wealth, and of men who no longer cared to fight in defense of their treasures. The same story came over the rivers by the lips of Roman prisoners taken in the border warfare, which was always going on. So you will see that everything was tending to draw the thoughts and hopes of these German warriors toward the south. There, once fairly beyond the rivers, they might hope for endless plunder, for lands enough and for slaves, who, being unfit for war, were good for nothing but to cultivate the land, while they, the conquerors, should have all the pleasure and glory of fighting, and in peace should live lives of ease and plenty. But besides these attractions, there were two other causes which were pressing the Germans steadily southward. One of these was increase of population. So long as a nation lives mainly by hunting and grazing, it needs an immense quantity of land. If it does not have this, the game will get scarce. The rivers will be fished out and the people must move or starve. We have reason to believe that the Germans in the 4th century were increasing rapidly in numbers. And as this increase went on, their lands were not large enough to support them. One of two things they must do: either clear and cultivate their own rough country, or take the lands which the industry of the Romans had made ready for them. A race of fresh and vigorous fighting men could not hesitate. They would take their neighbor's land. The second cause was a pressure from behind. We shall speak of this at some length by and by. For the present, we need to remember only that the east and north of the Germans were immense masses of other and still ruder barbarians, Slavs, and men of the great Tartar race, who were pushing upon them from time to time with great violence and were only waiting for them to move in order to press on and occupy the lands they left empty. Thus, all these forces were acting at the same time, with the continuous effect of drawing and pushing the Germans toward the south and west. The time had come when the frontier must be broken. Any occasion, however slight, might bring about the break. It would be wrong to suppose that this attack had not been long expected by the Roman government. For nearly 400 years, it had strained every nerve. First, to conquer the Germans on their own soil, as it had conquered so many another nation, and then to hold the frontier against ever-repeated barbarian attacks. During the reign of Augustus, several expeditions were made across the Lower Rhine, but this foreign attack only served to draw together the scattered forces of the Germans, who under the great leader Hermann so utterly defeated the Roman armies in the great battle of the Teutoburg forest that, in spite of partial successes, no Roman armed force could succeed in getting a permanent hold upon the north of Germany. The attempt was given up, and when next we find the two races at war, it is the Germans who make the attack, and in the terrible war of the Marcomanni on the upper Danube, put the enormous resources of the great empire of Marcus Aurelius to the most terrible test. An advantageous peace alone saved the Danube frontier. For another century, the same story was repeated. Rapid expeditions of German warriors swept over the country, even down into Italy and through the midst of Gaul. They were driven back and held in check only by the aid of their own countrymen, serving with the Roman legions, or settled near the frontier as allies of the empire. Nothing but a lack of union among themselves prevented them, even then, from occupying permanently the land of Rome. It is wonderful to see how, even as late as this, the great discipline and better organization of the Roman army and the more complete system of the Roman government prevailed against the superior brute force, but less intelligent leadership of the Germans. Let us now look at the names and positions of the various German peoples just before the final break of the frontier. They had formerly been broken up into a vast multitude of petty tribes, living each for itself, but now, ever since the first great attack of the Romans, these tribes had been uniting into great confederations. In the northeast, beyond the line of the Elbe and Saale, where once Germanic peoples had lived, a new race, the Slavs, had come in, while the former occupants had moved toward the south, where we shall soon find them. In the northwest, along the river mouths, were the Saxons, our nearest relatives, least influenced by the name of Rome, and in fact never as a nation to leave this their original home. Westward, along the lower Rhine, were the Franks, the future conquerors of Gaul, destined to be the one race which in time was to prevail over all the rest, and to give law and order to the continent of Europe. Above the Franks, in the Rhine Valley, were the Alemanni, all men,